The first time 55-year-old Richard saw Evan, he thought the young man was simply having a bad night. But when Richard quietly offered to help with Evan's financial problems, neither of them expected that one act of kindness would turn into something neither could control. Richard paid his rent, his car payment, even his basic expenses. Evan told himself it was temporary. Until one evening, he discovered that Richard had secretly leased him a luxury apartment. Standing inside the expensive home, Evan stared at the keys in his hand and whispered, "Is he helping me? Or is he trying to own my life?" And what Evan didn't know was that Richard had already fallen in love with him. The first time 55-year-old Richard saw Evan, he thought the young man was simply having a bad night. Evan sat alone at a corner table in an upscale restaurant in downtown Chicago, staring at a menu he clearly couldn't afford. He had ordered the cheapest coffee on the list nearly 40 minutes earlier, and it had already gone cold. Richard noticed because he had spent most of his life noticing things other people missed. A successful businessman, Richard was accustomed to reading contracts, negotiations, and people. But lately, his ability to read people had become less useful than it once was. He could understand a complicated business deal in minutes, yet he couldn't understand why his enormous apartment felt so empty every night. He was used to expensive dinners. He was used to quiet rooms. He was not used to someone sitting alone with the same tired expression he had seen in his own reflection for years. Evan finally closed the menu. His shoulders dropped. Richard looked away, telling himself it wasn't his business. Then the waiter approached Evan. "Everything okay?" Evan forced a smile. "Yeah, I was just waiting for someone." The waiter glanced around the nearly empty table. "Your friend." Something like that. Richard almost smiled. He knew that answer. It was the kind people gave when they didn't want strangers to know they were alone. A few minutes later, Evan stood and walked toward the exit. As he passed Richard's table, his phone slipped from his hand and landed on the floor. "Hey!" Evan turned. Richard picked up the phone and held it out. "Thanks." Their fingers briefly touched. Evan looked at him properly for the first time. Richard saw tired brown eyes, messy dark hair, and the kind of face that looked younger when it smiled. "Rough night?" Richard asked. Evan hesitated. "Rough month." Richard raised an eyebrow. Evan immediately looked embarrassed. "Sorry. I don't usually tell strangers my problems." "Neither do I." That made Evan laugh. It was a small laugh, but something about it stayed with Richard. They started talking. First, it was nothing important. Work, the city, the restaurant. Evan eventually admitted he had recently moved to Chicago because he wanted to build a career in digital marketing. He had big plans, but his current job wasn't paying enough to cover everything. "I thought moving here would be difficult," Evan said. "I just didn't realize how quickly difficult becomes impossible." Richard listened. "You'll figure it out." Evan smiled faintly. "That's what I keep telling myself." Richard looked at him for a moment. "You will." There was something different in the way Richard said it. Not pity. Not empty encouragement. Certainty. Evan noticed. "Do you always sound that confident?" "Usually." "Must be nice." Richard smiled. "Sometimes." They exchanged numbers before leaving. Neither of them knew that simple decision would change both their lives. Over the next few weeks, Richard and Evan began seeing each other regularly. Sometimes they met for coffee. Sometimes Richard invited Evan to dinner. And sometimes they simply drove around the city talking about nothing. Richard learned that Evan hated being treated like he was helpless. Evan learned that Richard could buy almost anything he wanted but rarely bought anything for himself. Richard's life looked perfect from the outside. Evan's looked like it was constantly one unexpected bill away from falling apart. Yet somehow they understood each other. One evening, Evan received a call while they were having dinner. His expression changed immediately. Richard watched him step away from the table. When Evan returned, he tried to smile. "Everything okay?" "Yeah." Richard didn't believe him. "Evan." Evan sighed. "My landlord says I have 3 days to pay the remaining rent." Richard put his fork down. "How much?" Evan shook his head. "Don't." "How much?" "I'll handle it." "You just said you have 3 days." I'll figure something out. Richard leaned back. Let me help. Evan immediately shook his head. No. Why? Because I don't want to become somebody's charity case. Richard's expression softened. I didn't offer charity. Then what are you offering? Richard paused. Help. Evan looked at him suspiciously. Why? Because I can. That doesn't answer the question. Richard smiled slightly. Maybe because I like you. Evan's defenses weakened for a second. Richard continued. I can cover your rent for a few months. Your car payment too, if that's what's putting pressure on you. Evan stared at him. You barely know me. I know enough. I can't accept that. You can pay me back someday. Evan laughed quietly. With what? Your success. Evan looked down. There was no arrogance in Richard's offer. Nos magnis. Just sincerity. Finally, Evan nodded. Temporary. Richard nodded. Temporary. That was how it began. Richard paid Evan's overdue rent. Then his car payment. Then a few basic expenses when Evan's paycheck came late. Evan kept telling himself it was temporary. And for a while he believed it. But something else was changing. Richard became part of Evan's daily life. He remembered how Evan took his coffee. He noticed when Evan skipped meals. He sent messages asking whether he'd gotten home safely. When Evan had an important interview, Richard was the first person to wish him luck. And when Evan failed the interview, Richard didn't tell him to try harder. He simply showed up. They sat in Richard's car outside Evan's apartment. I feel like I'm failing at everything, Evan admitted. Richard turned toward him. You're not failing. It feels like it. You're struggling. That's different. Evan looked at him. How do you always know what to say? I don't. Richard smiled. I just know what I wish someone had said to me when I needed it. Evan's chest tightened. For the first time, he wondered what had happened to make Richard so good at recognizing loneliness. Weeks became months. Evan's feelings changed quietly. There wasn't one dramatic moment. There were hundreds of small ones. Richard remembering his favorite dessert. Richard waiting outside his office after a late shift. Richard listening when Evan talked about his dreams. Richard laughing when Evan made fun of his expensive suits. And sometimes, when they sat together in silence, Evan caught himself looking at Richard a little too long. He knew the age difference was enormous. 31 years. Sometimes that number frightened him. But when he was with Richard, it somehow disappeared. One night, Richard invited him to dinner at his penthouse. Evan stepped inside and stared at the view. This place is ridiculous. Richard smiled. You don't like it? I didn't say that. They ate dinner by the windows. Later, they stood together looking over the city. Evan quietly said, You're lonely. Richard looked at him. What makes you say that? You have everything. Richard gave a quiet laugh. Everything isn't the same as someone. Evan didn't know what to say. Richard looked away. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Evan reached out and gently touched Richard's hand. It was brief, almost accidental. But Richard didn't pull away. Neither did Evan. That moment changed something between them. Neither was ready to name it, but both felt it. A few days later, Evan received a message from Richard asking him to meet. When Evan arrived, Richard handed him an envelope. What is this? Open it. Inside was an address. Evan looked confused. What's this? Your new apartment. Evan laughed nervously. My what? Richard's expression remained serious. I leased it for you. Evan's smile disappeared. You did what? Your current place isn't safe, and the rent keeps increasing. This is closer to your work. You leased an apartment for me? Yes. Evan stared at the address. Then at Richard. How much is it? Don't worry about it. Richard. It's taken care of. Evan's stomach tightened. Why didn't you ask me? I knew you'd say no. Exactly. Richard's expression hardened slightly. I was trying to make your life easier. I know. Then what's wrong? Evan looked down at the envelope. The apartment was in one of the most expensive buildings in the city. A place Evan could never afford on his own. And suddenly, The arrangement didn't feel temporary anymore. Felt much bigger, much more serious. Evan slowly looked back at Richard. I don't know where your help ends anymore. Richard's eyes softened. I would never hurt you. I know. Then trust me. Evan swallowed. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. But as he stood there holding the keys Richard had just given him, one terrifying question refused to leave his mind. Was Richard helping him because he loved him, or was he slowly building a life that Evan would eventually be unable to leave? Evan didn't take the apartment keys. Not that night. He stood in Richard's living room with the envelope still in his hand, staring at the older man as if he were trying to recognize someone he had thought he knew. You should have asked me, Evan said quietly. Richard's jaw tightened. I thought I was doing something good. You were. Then why does it feel like I've done something wrong? Because you keep making decisions for me. Richard looked away. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Evan placed the keys on the table. I need time. Richard nodded. Take it. Evan walked out. But he didn't stop thinking about the apartment. Or Richard. Or the strange mixture of gratitude and fear growing inside him. 3 days later, Evan went back. Richard didn't ask why. He simply handed him the keys again. This time, Evan accepted them. The apartment was beautiful. Too beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A modern kitchen. A bedroom larger than Evan's entire old apartment. When he stood in the middle of it, he felt like an outsider inside someone else's life. Richard appeared behind him. You don't like it. I love it. Then what's wrong? Evan turned. I don't know if I deserve this. Richard stepped closer. You deserve to live without constantly worrying about your next bill. Evan's eyes softened. And what do you get? Richard smiled. Your company. That answer should have frightened Evan. Instead, it made his heart beat faster. Their relationship slowly changed after that. They spent more time together. Richard took Evan to restaurants where the menus had no prices. He surprised him with weekend trips. He bought him a watch after Evan mentioned seeing it in a store window. Evan loved every thoughtful gesture, but each gift came with a tiny knot in his stomach. One evening, Richard handed him another box. Evan didn't open it. What is it? Open it. I don't need anything. I know. Evan finally opened the box. Inside was an expensive laptop, the exact model Evan had been saving for. His expression fell. Richard, you need it for your work. I was going to buy one myself. You can use your money for something else. Evan closed the box. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Richard frowned. What? You keep solving everything before I even get the chance. Richard's expression softened. I just want to make things easier. I know. Evan sighed. And that's what makes it difficult. Richard stepped closer. Why? Because every time you help me, I feel like I'm falling deeper into something I don't know how to get out of. Richard went silent. Evan immediately regretted the words. I didn't mean. I understand. No, you don't. Richard looked at him. I understand more than you think. There was something in his voice that made Evan stop. Richard sat down. After a long silence, he finally said, I wasn't always like this. Evan sat beside him. What happened? Richard stared at the floor. I loved someone once. Evan waited. More than I thought possible. His voice was quiet. I built my life around him. Trusted him with everything. My home. My business. My future. What happened? He left. Evan's chest tightened. Why? Richard gave a bitter smile. He stayed until he found someone who could give him something I couldn't. Evan didn't ask what that meant. He already understood. Did he cheat? Richard nodded. He didn't just cheat on me. He convinced me I was imagining things. Made me feel foolish for trusting him. Richard looked toward the window. After that, I decided I would never need anyone again. Evan reached for his hand. Richard looked down at their fingers. You don't have to be afraid of me leaving, Evan whispered. Richard looked at him. That's not what I'm afraid of. Then what? Richard's eyes met his. I'm afraid you'll leave. The honesty in those words broke something inside Evan. For the first time, he understood. Richard's gifts weren't only about generosity. They were about security, control, fear. Richard was trying to build something so comfortable that Evan would never have a reason to walk away. And somehow, Evan knew that wasn't what he wanted. Weeks passed. Their relationship became more intimate emotionally. They talked late into the night. They shared fears, dreams, regrets. Sometimes Richard would fall asleep beside Evan on the couch, and Evan would simply watch him. The age difference didn't feel important in those moments. Richard wasn't a 55-year-old businessman. He was just Richard, the man who remembered everything Evan said, the man who listened, the man who made Evan feel safe. And Evan was falling in love with him. That realization scared him more than the apartment ever had. One Friday evening, they were supposed to leave for a weekend trip. Evan arrived at Richard's place and found a new set of luggage waiting for him. He stared at it. "What is this?" "For the trip." Richard smiled. Evan didn't. "Did you buy this too?" Richard paused. "Yes." "Richard." "What?" "I can't keep doing this." Richard's expression changed. "Doing what?" "Letting you pay for everything." "I don't mind." "But I do." Richard sighed. "You don't have to feel guilty. This isn't guilt." "Then what is it?" Evan looked at him. "It's dignity." Richard went silent. Evan's voice shook. "I love being with you. I love what we have. But I don't want to wake up one day and realize I can't tell where your life ends and mine begins." Richard's face hardened. "So you think I'm controlling you?" "I think you're scared." That hit harder than Evan expected. Richard looked away. "Maybe I am." "I love you," Evan said. Richard slowly looked back. "But I don't want to owe you my life." The room became completely silent. Richard's eyes filled with hurt. He nodded once. "Then you won't." Evan's heart sank. "What does that mean?" "It means I'll stop paying for everything." "Richard, you want independence. I'll give you independence." His voice was calm, but his eyes weren't. "No more rent." Evan swallowed. "No more car payment." Richard continued. "No more gifts. No more expenses." Evan felt tears gathering in his eyes. "I didn't ask you to disappear." Richard looked at him. "I know. Then don't punish me for loving you." Richard's expression broke for just a moment. "I'm not punishing you." "Then what are you doing?" "Trying to learn how to love you without holding on too tightly." Evan couldn't answer. That night, he left Richard's apartment alone. For the first time in months, he drove home without knowing whether Richard would call. He didn't. One day passed, then two, then three. Evan kept checking his phone. Nothing. The silence hurt more than he expected. Then, on the fifth day, a letter arrived at his apartment. There was no return address. Only his name. Evan opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single page. Richard had written it himself. Evan read the first line, then stopped breathing. Richard was leaving Chicago. Not for a business trip. Not for a weekend. Permanently. Evan sat down on the edge of the bed, the letter shaking in his hands. For months, he had been afraid that Richard's money would become the thing holding them together. Now the money was gone, and suddenly, Evan realized what frightened him even more: losing Richard. Evan read the letter 3 times before the words finally sank in. Richard was leaving Chicago. He had already arranged most of it. His company would continue operating through his senior team, and Richard planned to spend the next few years traveling between offices on the West Coast and Europe. There was no dramatic goodbye in the letter. No accusation. No attempt to make Evan feel guilty. That somehow made it worse. At the bottom, Richard had written only one sentence. "I hope you build the life you always told me you wanted." Evan stared at those words until his eyes blurred. "No," he whispered. He grabbed his phone and called Richard. Straight to voicemail. Again, nothing. Evan stood up so quickly that the letter fell to the floor. He didn't know where Richard was, but he knew where Richard's office was. 20 minutes later, Evan was standing outside the glass doors of Richard's company. The receptionist recognized him immediately. "Mr. Evan? Is Richard here?" She hesitated.
I'm sorry.
"He's in a meeting. I'll wait." An hour passed. Then another. Finally, Richard walked through the lobby. He stopped the moment he saw Evan. Neither man spoke. Richard looked tired. Evan looked terrified. "You're leaving?" Richard slowly nodded. "Yes." "You were really going to leave without telling me?" "I wrote you a letter." "That isn't telling me." Richard looked away. "I didn't know what else to say." "You could have said you were scared." Richard's eyes returned to him. "I was. Of me. Of what happens if I stay." Evan stepped closer. "Then tell me." Richard shook his head. "You're 24. And you're 55. I know. You've known the entire time." Richard's jaw tightened. "That's exactly the problem." Evan stared at him. Richard lowered his voice. "You're young, Evan. You have decades ahead of you. I don't want you waking up at 35 and wondering why you spent your 20s with a man who was already thinking about retirement." Evan felt something crack inside him. "You think I'm going to regret you?" "I think you might. You don't get to decide that for me." "I know." "Then stop deciding everything for me." Richard looked down. "You're right." Evan took a breath. "Do you love me?" Richard didn't answer. "Richard." His voice broke. "Do you love me?" Richard finally looked at him. "Yes." One word. It was enough to make Evan's eyes fill with tears. "Then why are you leaving?" "Because loving you isn't the same as being good for you." Evan shook his head. "You don't get it." "Then make me understand." Evan stepped closer. "I don't miss your apartment." Richard went still. "I don't miss the expensive restaurants." Silence. "I don't miss the trips." Evan's voice trembled. "I miss you." Richard's eyes softened. Evan continued. "When you stopped paying for everything, I thought I was going to feel relieved." Richard waited. "I didn't." A tear slipped down Evan's cheek. "I felt like someone had taken the most important person in my life away from me." Richard closed his eyes briefly. "Evan, I don't need you to pay for my life." Richard looked at him. "I want you in my life." The words hung between them. Richard didn't move. Neither did Evan. Finally, Richard whispered, "What happens when you change your mind?" "I won't." "You can't promise that." "Neither can you." Richard looked surprised. Evan smiled sadly. "That's what love is. Neither of us gets a guarantee." Richard looked away. "I've spent years trying to make everything certain." "I know. I thought if I could give you enough, you'd never have a reason to leave." Evan's heart ached. "And that's exactly what I don't want." Richard looked at him again. "So what do you want?" "A chance." "A chance for what?" "To prove I can stand beside you without standing underneath you." Richard said nothing. Evan wiped his face. "I want to build my own life." Richard nodded slowly. "How?" "I'll find a better job." "You already have one." "I'll find a better one." "And if you don't?" "I'll keep trying." Richard almost smiled. "That sounds like you." Evan smiled back. "I'll pay my own rent." Richard nodded. "My own car." Another nod. "And the apartment?" Richard's expression changed. "I'll give it back." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." "Why?" "Because I need to know that if you stay with me, you're staying because you want me." Richard looked deeply moved. "Evan, I don't want to be your responsibility." Richard stepped closer. "You never were." Evan looked into his eyes. "Then let me prove it." Over the next few months, Evan rebuilt his life. It wasn't easy. He moved into a smaller apartment. He sold some of the things Richard had bought him. He returned the luxury car. He took a demanding marketing job at a growing tech company and worked longer hours than he had ever worked before. There were nights when he was exhausted, nights when he wondered whether he had made the right decision. But every paycheck felt different. It was his. Every bill he paid felt like proof that he could stand on his own. And through it all, Richard stayed away from his finances. But he didn't disappear. Sometimes he'd send a simple message. "How did the interview go?" Or, "Don't forget to eat." Nothing more. No money. No gifts. No rescue. Just Richard. And strangely, that made Evan love him even more. 6 months later, Evan was promoted. Then he started a small digital marketing business on the side. His first client was tiny. The payment barely covered groceries. But Evan framed the invoice. It was the first money he'd earned entirely through something he'd built himself. One evening, he called Richard. "I got my first major client." There was silence. Then Richard laughed. "I knew you would. You sound proud." "I am." Evan smiled. "I wish you were here." Richard's voice softened. "So do I." They met the following weekend. No luxury restaurant. No expensive hotel. Just a small neighborhood cafe. Richard arrived first. Evan walked in wearing an inexpensive jacket and carrying a worn leather bag. Richard smiled. "You look different." "Better or worse?" "Stronger." Evan sat across from him. "I feel stronger." They talked for hours. About work. About life. About everything they'd avoided discussing. Then Evan finally asked the question that had been sitting between them. "Are you still leaving?" Richard looked down. "I haven't decided." "Why?" "Because you keep giving me reasons to stay." Evan smiled. "Good." Richard laughed quietly. Then his expression became serious. "I love you." Evan's heart skipped. Richard continued. "But I still don't know if this is fair to you." Evan reached across the table. "Then don't make the decision for me." Richard looked at their hands. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Richard squeezed his hand. For a moment, everything felt right. Then Richard's expression changed. "There is something else." Evan's smile faded. "What?" Richard took a breath. "My biggest fear isn't your age." "Then what is it?" "You'll wake up one day and realize you gave up your youth for me." Evan stared at him. Richard continued quietly. "You'll look at me and wonder what your life could have been." Evan's eyes softened. He leaned closer. "Richard, I don't want to spend my life wondering what I could have had." Richard looked at him. "I want to live the life I choose." "And you choose me?" Evan smiled. "I choose you." Richard looked down at their joined hands. But the fear in his eyes hadn't completely disappeared. And Evan knew that saying it once wouldn't be enough. He would have to show Richard. Not with promises. Not with money. But with the life he was building for himself. And that was exactly what Evan intended to do. Richard's fear didn't disappear overnight. Even after Evan had built a life of his own, Richard still carried the same question inside him. What if Evan eventually regretted choosing him? For months, Richard kept a careful distance. He didn't disappear. He didn't walk away. But he refused to return to the relationship they had once had. No luxury apartment. No expensive gifts. No paying Evan's bills. If they had dinner, they split the check. If they traveled, they planned it together. And somehow, the relationship felt more real than it ever had before. Evan's small business began growing. His first few clients became 10. 10 became 20. He worked late nights, made mistakes, learned from them, and slowly built something that belonged entirely to him. Richard never offered money, but he offered advice when Evan asked. Nothing more. One evening, Evan sat across from Richard at a small restaurant they had started visiting regularly. Richard watched him smile at his phone. "Good news. My biggest client just renewed for another year." Richard smiled. "I told you you'd do it." Evan put his phone down. "You always say that." "Because it's true." Evan studied him. "You know what I realized?" "What?" "I don't think I fell in love with your money." Richard raised an eyebrow. "I hope not." Evan laughed. "I fell in love with the person who believed in me before I believed in myself." Richard's smile slowly disappeared. "Evan." "No." "Let me finish." Richard nodded. "You gave me things I didn't know how to give myself. Confidence. Patience. A reason to believe my life could become something bigger." He reached across the table. "But then you taught me something else." "What?" "That love isn't supposed to make one person smaller." Richard looked down. Evan continued. "I don't want to be your project." Richard smiled sadly. "You never were." And I don't want you to be my provider. I know. I want to be your partner. Richard looked into his eyes. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Richard said quietly, I'm still afraid. Of what? That you'll regret this. Evan squeezed his hand. Then watch me. Richard frowned slightly. Watch you. Watch what I do. Evan leaned forward. I'm not asking you to trust a promise. I'm asking you to trust the life I'm building. Richard looked at him. And if 10 years from now you wake up and want something different? Evan smiled. Then we'll talk about it. Richard laughed softly. You make everything sound so simple. No. Evan shook his head. I'm just not afraid of uncertainty anymore. That night, Richard walked Evan home. They stopped outside Evan's apartment. It was small. Nothing like the luxury place Richard had once leased for him. But Evan looked at it with pride. This is mine. Richard smiled. I know. Evan turned toward him. Do you remember the apartment you gave me? How could I forget? I still have the keys. Richard looked surprised. Why? Because I was waiting for the right time. Evan disappeared inside. A minute later, he returned holding a small envelope. Richard looked at it. What is that? Come with me tomorrow. The next morning, they stood outside the luxury apartment building. The same building where their entire relationship had once begun to feel complicated. Evan held the keys in his hand. Richard looked at him. You don't have to do this. I know. They entered the apartment. Everything was still there. The beautiful furniture, the city view, the expensive kitchen, the life Richard had once imagined Evan living. Evan walked to the window. For a moment, he remembered the night he'd first stood there. He had been overwhelmed by everything. The money, the comfort, the uncertainty. Now he felt something completely different. Peace. Richard stood behind him. I wanted you to have this, he said quietly. I know. I thought giving you everything would make you happy. Evan turned. It did. Richard looked surprised. For a while, Evan walked closer. But happiness isn't the same as belonging. Richard's eyes softened. Evan placed the keys in Richard's palm. I don't want your apartment. Richard looked at the keys. Then at Evan. I want your hand. Richard's eyes filled with emotion. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Then he slowly closed his fingers around Evan's hand instead of the keys. Evan smiled. Richard whispered, You stayed. Of course I stayed. Even when I stopped paying for everything. Yes. Even when I pushed you away. Yes. Even when I told you I was afraid you'd regret me. Evan smiled through tears. Especially then. Richard pulled him into a gentle embrace. For the first time, there was no transaction between them. No debt. No obligación. No expensive gift. Just two people choosing each other. Richard rested his forehead against Evan's. I don't know how many years I have ahead of me. Evan smiled. Then let's stop counting them. Richard laughed softly. You really are stubborn. And you're really old. Richard raised an eyebrow. Evan immediately laughed. I mean, Richard pulled him closer. Careful. Evan grinned. See? Still got it. They both laughed. Then Richard became serious. I love you. Evan's smile softened. I love you too. Their kiss was gentle and unhurried, carrying everything they had survived. The fear, the distance, the arguments, the money, the age gap, the uncertainty, all of it. Later that evening, they walked through the city holding hands. People stared. Some smiled. Others didn't understand. A few of Richard's friends had already questioned the relationship. Some told him Evan was too young. Some told Evan Richard was too old. Others assumed the relationship existed because of Richard's wealth. But neither man explained himself anymore. They didn't need to. Their relationship had already survived the one test that mattered. When the money disappeared, Evan stayed. When the comfort disappeared, Evan stayed. When Richard tried to leave, Evan followed. Not because he needed to be rescued, but because he had chosen the man he loved. And Richard finally understood something he had spent years refusing to believe. Love could not be secured with money, couldn't be guaranteed with gifts, couldn't be protected by building a life someone was afraid to leave. Real love had to be chosen freely, again and again. The next morning, Richard transferred the luxury apartment back to the management company. Evan returned to his small apartment. His business continued growing. Richard's company continued thriving. Their lives remained different. Their ages remained different. Their backgrounds remained different. But their relationship was finally equal. Richard no longer tried to buy Evan's future. Evan no longer felt like he owed Richard his happiness. They simply stood beside each other. One evening, months later, Evan came home from work and found Richard waiting outside with 2 coffees. Evan smiled. "You know, you could come inside." Richard handed him a cup. "I know. Then why are you standing out here?" Richard smiled. "Because I wanted to ask permission." Evan laughed. "For coffee? For everything?" Evan looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached for Richard's hand. "You never needed permission to love me." Richard squeezed his fingers. "And you never needed my money to stay." Evan leaned against him. "I never stayed for the money. I know that now." They stood together beneath the evening lights. No luxury apartment. No expensive car. No gifts. Just 2 hands intertwined. And for the first time, Richard wasn't afraid of Evan's future. Because he finally understood that if Evan ever stayed, it would be because he wanted to. Not because Richard had paid for his life. Not because the age gap made him feel obligated. Not because the luxury made leaving difficult. Evan stayed because he loved him, and Richard finally allowed himself to believe it. Their story had never really been about a 55-year-old businessman and a 24-year-old man. It had been about 2 lonely people finding each other, losing each other, and learning that love becomes strongest when both people are free to walk away and still choose to stay together. If Richard and Evan's story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional gay love stories. And tell me in the comments, do you believe true love can overcome a huge age gap? If you were Evan, would you choose the money and luxury, or choose love without any strings attached? Your answer might become part of our next story.